Hello, YouTube. So today I am going to continue the series on Orientalism, and I am going to talk about a historical method that could possibly be a way of subverting modernity and yet at the same time taking some tools from it, but subsuming it under a more, you might say, indigenous Islamic epistemology. And this is just frankly my opinion. You can agree or disagree. This isn't like the only historical method that I use. It's not my primary MO. It's just something I came up with as kind of an intellectual experiment here. And I want to know what you all think about it, or what are alternative ways that maybe we can think about philosophizing about doing history of the Islamic world without being colonizing. And so, what historiographical method may subvert modernity and operate in a non oppressive way to non Enlightenment epistemologies? I propose to Western academics a fusion of Michel Foucault's notion of genealogy and William Chittick's notion of knowing oneself to better understand what it is to be human. So the background that I have here to hide my unorganized room is William Chittick's book, Science of the Cosmos, Science of the Soul, the Pertinence of Islamic Cosmology in the Modern World. William Chittick, he is practicing sheikh and academic, and got his PhD in Iran before the revolution, to the best of my understanding. And he's quite well established in the field of Islamic studies in the Western academe. And so he wrote this book, Science of the Cosmos, Science of the Soul, which he proposes a more indigenous Islamic way of doing history and trying to understand Islamic texts. And I'm also going to look, I don't know how well you can see this here with the kind of green screen effect I'm using, but this is Michel Foucault. And this is Aesthetics, Method, and Epistemology, edited by James Fabian. So Essential Works of Foucault, Volume 2. And the section that I'm going to be focusing on is called Nietzsche. Let me go back here. It's, boy, did I lose my place in the book? Oh, boy. There we go. So Nietzsche, Genealogy, History. And this can be found on page 369. Nietzsche, Genealogy, History. And I kind of want to put that in conversation with William Chittick. And so not everything about post-modernity, I would say, is bad, because there's a lot of people that they just want to outright toss it out, say it's a bunch of hocus pocus, it's a bunch of liberal garbage, or it's, people say all kinds of weird things. And the way I look at it, the way I look at viewing any philosopher, any intellectual thinker, is you take the good from them and leave the bad. And so I want to put William Chittick in conversation with Michel Foucault. I want to subsume things from Michel Foucault under an indigenous Islamic epistemology as proposed by Chittick. So I propose to Western academics a fusion of Michel Foucault's notion of genealogy and William Chittick's notion of knowing oneself to better understand what it is to be human. Then we can eviscerate and efface the self eviscerate and efface the self of the historian's ego in an anti-modern, post-secular fashion. That way, an even, level playing field can be achieved where all epistemologies can interact as peers. Michel Foucault's essay, Nietzsche, Genealogy, History, is no doubt profound to the field of history in a very broad sense. The most significant profundity was a simple idea that genealogy must record the singularity of events outside of any monotonous finality. That is, Foucault says, genealogy does not pretend to go back in time to restore an unbroken continuity that operates beyond the dispersion of oblivion. Its task is not to demonstrate that the past actively exists in the present, that it continues secretly to animate the present, having imposed a predetermined form on all of its vicissitudes. Genealogy does not resemble the evolution of a species and does not map the destiny of a people, end quote. Foucault also puts it simply, the genealogist needs to dispel the chimeras of the origin, end quote. Historians, especially those of the Orientalist bent, have traditionally used a narrative style, which implies a beginning, middle, and an end. This progressionist trope of modern historiography is exactly what Foucault's text aims to obliterate, as it is a mere projection or construct of the person doing history. Christian K. Wedemeyer, professor at the University of Chicago who specializes in Tantric Buddhism, elucidatingly says, it is the historian who imparts identity, meaning, and narrative function to the otherwise mute and lifeless data. This much is widely recognized today by professional historians and philosophers of history, yet its implications are often overlooked in practice, end quote. He later on says, histories are not ultimately the products of facts that inspire them, but of the poetical imagination of the historian who implots them, an imagination that, in short, situates these facts within one of several conventional narrative structures, end quote. Both Foucault's text and Wedemeyer's are repudiating the archetype that, like all living beings, histories also go through a birth or origin, a growth, maturation, a decline, and death. Thus, cities, nations, schools of thought, political parties, and even religions have been conceptualized in these terms, and the events of their histories interpreted accordingly. Foucault summarizes quite succinctly what exactly he means by genealogy in saying, it is no longer a question of judging the past in the name of a truth that only we can possess in the present, but of risking the destruction of the subject who seeks knowledge, connaissance, in the endless deployment of the will to knowledge, or savoir. Unlike Chittick, who wants to know thyself in order to understand the humanities, Foucault wants complete obliteration of the self, like the Sufis who strive for finat, self-obliteration. The historian effaces his proper individuality so that others may enter the stage and reclaim their own speech. He is divided against himself, forced to silence his preferences and overcome his distaste, to blur his own perspective and replace it with the fiction of a universal geometry, to mimic death in order to enter the kingdom of the dead, to adopt faceless anonymity, end quote. That's Foucault. The Sufis also describe finat as al-maut qabla al-maut, the death before death. In the death of the self, we get the genealogist. In addition, what Nietzsche genealogy history does is historicize or genealogize a phenomenon exposing the problematical, idiosyncratic, human, all too human underpinning of that phenomenon, as Wedemeyer says. But not focusing on a narrative of beginning, middle, and end, one may instead highlight other phenomena in history. One that Foucault is known for highlighting is power and domination. Though Foucault's text does not accept the origin, he does use the word emergence, usually in describing the emergence of forces. This word emergence has become so common in the academy nowadays. This relationship of domination is no more a relationship than the place where it occurs is a place, and precisely for this reason, it is fixed throughout its history in rituals, meticulous procedures that impose rights and obligations. Foucault then says the role of genealogy is to record its history, the history of morals, ideals, and metaphysical concepts, the history of the concept of liberty or the ascetic life. As they stand for the emergence of different interpretations, they must be made to appear as events in the theater of procedure, end quote. The emergence or shifts of forces, shifts of power is an event. Foucault says an event consequently is not a decision, a treaty, a reign, or a battle, but the reversal of a relationship of forces, the usurpation of power, the appropriation of a vocabulary turned against those who had once used it, a domination that grows feeble, poisons itself, grows slack, the entry of a masked other. In defining what he means by discursive tradition, Talal Asad says, in short, there is no irreconcilable opposition between tradition and genealogy. The very attempt to purify tradition draws on genealogical arguments, points to contingencies, and draws on ambiguities that emerge over time. Genealogical critique is not a rejection of all grounding, as it is sometimes alleged. Its ground is this moment, the place in which one thinks, acts, and lives, and from which one regards past and future. But what exactly does Asad mean by this? Slightly earlier in Talal Asad's text, he talks about how tradition links the dead to the living. And this is his book, Secular Translations, by the way. So he talks about how tradition links the dead to the living and how tradition asks whether something in the tradition still properly belongs to it. He calls this genealogy translating the past into the present. He employs the example of whether the modern state is or is not compatible with Islamic tradition, perhaps alluding to Wa'il Halaq's book, The Impossible State, that I have previously mentioned elsewhere. Perhaps a more indigenous example would be Refuting ISIS, written by Sheikh Muhammad al-Yaqoubi, where he maintains that the nation state and democracy both do not contradict the Islamic tradition. Thus, they are Islamic, unlike ISIS, who considers both heresy and necessitates excommunication, takfir, of anybody who supports either democracy or a nation state. Yaqoubi does a genealogy, equating the early medieval concept of shura, oligarchical consultation, with contemporary democracy. For Asad, discursive tradition does not mean religion per se, but rather it signals an attempt to engage with it, to engage with multiple temporalities of those who aspire to a shared inheritance as well as those who reject it. Asad goes on to say the history of reform or genealogy of discursive tradition is precisely a matter of some Muslim trying to persuade others that what was hitherto thought to be outside of the tradition is really inside. In fact, it is the desire for reform or attempt to purify tradition that constantly brings about the need for discursive tradition to do genealogy. In fact, Chittick does such a genealogy as Asad mentions above. I want to assume that the intellectual tradition is not what it used to be, that it is still something, that it still has something to offer. What this something is, however, cannot be rediscovered or resuscitated as long as intellectual knowledge is treated as another form of transmitted knowledge, as it is normally done by modern scholarship. End quote. That's William Chittick. Rediscovering and resuscitating the intellectual tradition is genealogy. Chittick also says, although a good deal of thinking goes on among contemporary Muslims, little of it has roots in the Islamic intellectual tradition. It frequently calls upon the Quran and the Hadith as its witness, but it is based on habits of mind that were developed in the West during the modern period. In other words, Chittick's recitation is a genealogy bringing to the fore knowledges and ways of being from the past. To summarize Chittick's project with concision is to say that knowledge of the self via intellectual knowledge, aqli knowledge, helps one better understand the humanities and what it means to be human. He argues that it is impossible to understand classical Islamic texts without self-knowledge, ilm al-nafs. Intellectual knowledge is knowledge which brings tahqiq, an Arabic word that means to verify, to realize, and to edit. This word tahqiq also carries with it the connotations of inquest, examination, investigation, and revision. Intellectual knowledge conventionally focuses on metaphysics, cosmology, spiritual psychology, and ethics. All of this is done within the context of Tawheed, which is the primal unity that lies beneath and beyond surface multiplicity and gives meaning to all things. This is in contradistinction to takthir, increasing, where there is a void of a single center, a single orientation, any single purpose at all. From the Enlightenment emerged takthir and compartmentalization, where everyone is an expert in some tiny field of specialization, and information increases exponentially. The result is mutual incomprehension and universal disharmony. It is impossible to establish any unity of understanding, and no real communication takes place among specialists in different disciplines. Since people have no unifying principles, the result is an ever-increasing multiplicity of gods, small g, and ever-intensifying chaos. It is easy to say that Chittick is an advocate for interdisciplinary work. Chittick proposes an alternative impetus to gain knowledge, rather than to gain knowledge to dominate nature or to make life comfortable. We may gain knowledge in order to properly understand texts and the human condition better. The aim is to learn how to be human and actualize true human nature. The self is a microcosm and the universe the macrocosm. Therefore, the self, the aware subject, can take as its object of study the entire universe. One must study the macrocosm in order to understand the microcosm. By understanding the object, we simultaneously grasp the potentialities and abilities of the subject. We cannot study the natural world without learning about ourselves, wisdom inherent in the natural world. For example, we cannot understand Islamic texts without understanding ourselves. And we cannot understand ourselves without understanding Islamic texts. Thus dissipates the subject-object dichotomy inherent in the Cartesian cogito. Chittick calls this freedom from environmental limitations not just physical limitations, but also social, political, and psychological limitations. Much more profoundly, they can strive for freedom from all limitation and all constraints. Fana, self-obliteration, al-maut qabla al-maut, the death before death. The genealogist, the defacing of the historian. Chittick employs the word tajarrud, to strip away from. The self must be stripped away from everything else. In short, the intellectual tradition maintains that the human self has the potential to go beyond every standpoint and every perspective, to step outside culture, history, and even the universe. This ultimate standpoint is non-specific and indefinable, so it encompasses every specific and definable standpoint. The self knows that it is not limited by the objects of its knowledge or by the finiteness of things, nor by the limitations of the standpoint or that science. It also knows that it has the potential to perceive and comprehend all definitions and all limitations. The quest can have no closure because the infinite and absolute can never be reached. End quote. An early offshoot of Shi'ism, known as Ismailism, gained infamy in the Seljuk Empire, polemically, as hashishin, cannabis smokers. These Hashishin were small in number and resorted to guerrilla covert killings of Sunni political leaders. Hence emerged the English word assassin from Marco Polo's account of this Islamic sect called the Hashishin, assassins. Contemporary iterations may arise in the form of the mafia hitman or the cartel's sicario. What all three have in common is that they are often men of knowledge. They gain their knowledge by stalking their prey, learning their every move, their every habit, their schedule, their way of thinking, their comings and goings, and so on. The assassin becomes an expert on his victims. Then, at the most opportune time, the assassin strikes, leaving his victim dead without any trace of the assassin's presence. It was made to look natural, look like natural causes or an accident. This is how we can use Chittick's text and Foucault's text together. One must really deeply get to know oneself in order to obliterate oneself. We must become assassins of ourselves. Both Science of the Cosmos, Science of the Soul, and Nietzsche, Genealogy, History, have similar aims in taking self-projections out of knowledge production, out of historiography and genealogy. It is undeniable that the greater Chittickian and Foucauldian truth claims seem at odds from these two texts, and it is not my aim to argue the veracity of one or the other apropos of tertiary issues. While Chittick might say that Foucault's impetus is takthir, Foucault may accuse Chittick of positing an unbroken continuity. However, as a tool in the historian's toolbox, both Chittick and Foucault offer us a way to do history that subverts modernity. From the discontinuity, we get a tawheed of these methods. By learning oneself and defacing oneself to jarrud, the historian is therefore removing the self from doing history, that is, from subjecting the modernist narrative over a people. By study of the self, one may see one's own projections, constructs, and worldviews that may be inserted while doing history, whereas without the study of the self, one would remain oblivious. After recognizing one's drive to a certain narrative, then that individual can neutralize the target, destroying the modernist narrative one may carry. The historian offers this confused, anonymous European who no longer knows himself or what name he should adopt, the possibility of alternative identities more individualized and real than his own. One use of history that Foucault's text proposes is the systematic disassociation of our identity. For this rather weak identity, which we attempt to support and unify under a mask, is in itself only a parody. It is plural. Countless souls dispute its possession, numerous systems intersect and dominate one another. The purpose of history, guided by genealogy, is not to discover the roots of our identity, but to commit itself to dissipation. We are not discovering the roots of the European or identifying the Occidental, but rather we are effacing all vestiges of the self. But if genealogy in its own right gives rise to questions concerning our narrative land, native language, or laws that govern us, its intention is to reveal the heterogeneous systems that, masked by the self, inhibit the formation of any form of identity, thus evanescing the contradistinction between the modernist and the other. Discursive tradition can use Foucault's text as a way to do a type of genealogy that shows the contingencies and messiness of thought surrounding the tradition, historicizing traditional views as being mere products of their time and not the essence of tradition. And that's kind of what Muhammad al-Yaqoubi does when he refutes ISIS. The discursive traditionalist can look at new emergences of power, new domains, new savoir, and new connaissance. I enjoy conceiving Foucault looking at Chittick's text and coming to the conclusion that what Chittick has done, Spiritual philosophy, aka philosophy undertaken according to the injunction to care for oneself, as a practice essential to one's ethical development, for it is a spiritual commitment to the truth that requires self-disciplined attention to the character of one's thinking. We learn oneself, a form of caring for oneself, so that we may destroy oneself. It is no longer a question of judging the past in the name of a truth that we can only possess in the present, but of risking the destruction of the subject who seeks knowledge, connaissance, in the endless deployment of the will to knowledge, savoir. People are asleep, and when they die, they awaken. Attributed to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam.